I don't think I realized I was the outsider until I was old enough to see how much space love could take up and how little of it was left for me. Our living room always buzzed with some celebration of Celeste. Honor roll certificates, piano recitals, birthdays that were treated like royal coronations. Even when I tried to shine straight A's, a county-wide writing award, hell, even just being quiet and reliable, I was still a ghost in my own house. My name rarely made it into conversations unless it was a comparison, a sigh, a warning of what not to become. I learned early that love, at least in our house, was conditional. If you sparkled the way Celeste did, blonde curls bouncing, voice always lilting like a song, laughter that made people turn their heads, you were awarded. You were hugged, praised, given extra ice cream and an extra half hour before bed. But if you were like me, bookish, serious, a little too sharp around the edges, you were tolerated. Not abused, not mistreated exactly. Just forgotten. My parents didn't mean to be cruel. That's the funny thing. I don't think they even noticed the imbalance. It was like I was furniture, always there, useful sometimes, but not something you looked at unless you needed it. They were busy doting on Celeste, encouraging her dreams, framing her report cards. I don't think they ever asked what mine looked like. I stopped showing them after sophomore year. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 16. Celeste had just been cast as Sandy in the school production of Grease, and our entire dinner was a running commentary on her rehearsals, her costume fittings, how she planned to style her hair. I had just gotten my acceptance letter to a summer writing program at Northwestern, a big deal, a really big deal. I waited for a pause in the conversation. It never came. Eventually, I excused myself, went to my room, and cried into a pillow. No one came to check on me. No one noticed I was gone. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't stay in that house a minute longer than I had to. I started saving every dollar from my weekend job at the local bookstore, plotting escape routes in notebooks I kept hidden under my mattress. I didn't want to run away in the dramatic sense. I just wanted freedom, space where I could matter. The day I turned 18, I packed 2 duffel bags, hugged my little dog goodbye, and left a note on the kitchen table. No big tearful goodbye. Just a quiet exit while my parents were out taking Celeste to her senior portrait appointment. I boarded a Greyhound to Chicago with $612, a laptop, and the desperate hope that life outside of Ridgeway, Ohio would treat me like I was visible. Chicago wasn't easy. I worked 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and managing inventory at a supply warehouse at night. I lived in a studio that smelled like paint thinner and had a radiator that clanked like it was possessed. But for the first time in my life, every decision was mine. If I failed, it was on me. If I succeeded, no one would say it was just because I looked the part, smiled the right way, played the perfect daughter. There were nights when the loneliness was crushing. I'd walk past coffee shops where families sat talking and laughing, and I'd ache with something that had no name. But I never considered going back. I built a life, slowly, painfully, beautifully. I made friends who saw me, professors who believed in me, mentors who cheered me on without comparison to anyone else. And when I graduated with honors, I didn't invite my family. I didn't want pity applause or performative hugs. I wanted peace. It wasn't until years later, sitting in a tiny apartment with a new job offer and a sense of stability under my feet, that I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was just detached. Like I'd finally outgrown the need to be chosen by people who had every chance to choose me and never did. And yet, when people asked about my family, I still hesitated. I'd say I had a younger sister back home, or that my parents lived in Ohio, and changed the subject quickly. I didn't know how to explain that being an outsider wasn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it was the small things, the way no one asked about your day, the way birthdays felt like obligations rather than celebrations, the way you could scream inside and no one would hear it. Being overlooked doesn't leave bruises, but it does leave cracks. And I had spent the last decade learning how to live around them, how to build a life where I wasn't waiting for someone else to make me feel worthy. I had done it all on my own. And I was proud of that. Even if no one from home ever said it, I knew it in my bones. I mattered. I wasn't invisible anymore. When I met David Monroe, it was during the winter I thought I might freeze to death in more ways than one. The Chicago wind was relentless that year, bitter and unforgiving, but it was the kind of cold I had gotten used to. I was 26 and working at a mid-tier architecture firm downtown, trying to prove myself in every meeting, overcompensating for my silence in every childhood room. David was brought in as a consultant for a zoning project, sharp suit, thoughtful eyes, the kind of presence that made you want to lean in without realizing it. He wasn't flashy. That was the first thing I liked about him. He listened more than he spoke, always calculating, always patient. After our third coffee break, where we somehow ended up talking about Raymond Carver instead of city permits, I noticed the way he looked at me, like I wasn't furniture. Like I was the main character. It was unsettling at first, then addicting. Our romance wasn't a whirlwind, but it was steady. Safe. He asked about my day. He remembered the way I took my tea. He stood close without smothering. I told myself this was what it felt like to be seen, to be loved in a way that didn't feel like I was earning it by being someone else. When he proposed 2 years later at our favorite little cafe near Lincoln Park, I said yes through tears. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I actually believed I could finally have a life that wasn't built around proving I was worthy of one. By then, I had settled into a rhythm of pretending my family didn't exist. Christmases were spent on trips. Birthdays were quiet dinners. I told David only a little, just enough to explain the distance, not enough to invite questions. But he asked them anyway. Not pushy, just curious. "Don't you miss them?" he asked once, when I'd gotten quiet during a movie night. "Your parents, your sister?" I'd scoffed. You can't miss what you never really had. He didn't let it go, though. He kept bringing it up, gently, lovingly, suggesting that time might have changed things. That maybe they missed me more than I thought. That families are messy, but sometimes people grow. Eventually, I relented. Not because I believed him, but because I was tired. Tired of avoiding it. Tired of pretending it didn't still sting that I'd been erased so easily. So, when my mother called out of nowhere and mentioned they were throwing a barbecue for Celeste's birthday, David saw it as a sign. "Let's go," he said, smiling like it was a new beginning. "It'll be good. We'll go for a few hours, and if it's awful, we'll leave." I agreed, mostly to prove myself right. I told myself nothing had changed, that they'd be the same and I could finally close the door for good without guilt. But deep down, there was a whisper, a part of me that hoped they'd surprise me. That maybe my leaving had left a gap. That maybe Celeste wasn't still the sun they orbited around. The barbecue was held at my parents' house, same white siding, same rusting swing set in the backyard, same overgrown rose bushes that no one ever bothered to trim. As soon as we stepped out of the car, I felt it. That old air, heavy with judgment and sugar from the lemonade my mother always made too sweet. My mother greeted David with a tight smile and a stiff hug. She looked at me like I was a guest who forgot to RSVP. My father didn't say much. He never did. And then there was Celeste, still golden, still glowing, still the center of everything. She hugged David with an ease that irritated me instantly, her laugh a little too loud, her hand resting on his arm a second too long. I told myself it was nothing. She was always touchy, always charming. She didn't mean anything by it. David handled it all well, to his credit. He was polite, warm, the perfect guest. He asked questions about their garden, complimented the food, nodded in all the right places. He didn't flinch when my mother talked about how amazing Celeste was doing at her new event planning job, or how she was thinking about starting a podcast. I watched from the sidelines, as I always had, and tried not to let the old ache in my chest rise to the surface. But what unsettled me more was how easily David slid into their world. He laughed at Celeste's stories, clinked glasses with my father, complimented the lemon bars like they were heaven sent. He didn't see the undercurrents, the way my mother's compliments were barbed when directed at me, or how Celeste kept steering every conversation back to herself. I started to feel like I was the outsider again, only this time, in my own marriage. By the time we got in the car that night, I felt unmoored. David was glowing from the social ease of it all, talking about how nice it was to meet them, how we should visit more often. I just stared out the window, heart sinking, wondering what I'd done by opening that door again. I had worked so hard to outrun that house, those people, that version of myself that was never enough. And now I had brought it all back in. And Celeste, God help me, she had looked at David like he was just another thing she could take. And I hated myself for noticing. I still remember the exact moment I found out I was pregnant. It was a Thursday morning, and I was running late for work, already halfway out the door when I realized my period was 5 days overdue. It wasn't the first time I'd been late, but something felt different, like a quiet hum beneath my skin that hadn't been there before. I bought a test at the corner pharmacy on a whim, barely expecting anything, and took it as I brushed my teeth. 2 pink lines. Faint, but undeniable. I just stared, toothbrush dangling from my mouth, hands trembling. I wasn't sure if I was more stunned or thrilled. For the first time in forever, something unexpected felt good. Warm. Hopeful. I called David immediately. He was at the office, but when I told him, he laughed, actually laughed, and said, "We're having a baby," like he couldn't believe it. I could hear the smile in his voice. "This is amazing, Lena." That night, he came home with flowers and takeout, and we sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, dreaming about names and nursery colors and whether the baby would inherit his dimples or my stubborn streak. I let myself fall into the idea of a family, our family, one that didn't hurt the way mine had. I believed, so foolishly, that this was our beginning. But then the shift began. It was subtle at first, little things I could excuse. David lingering at my parents' house after I'd already left, claiming he stayed behind to help clean up. Him laughing too hard at Celeste's jokes, brushing my arm absent-mindedly when I asked him something but giving her his full attention when she spoke. At one point, I saw them sitting on the porch swing, heads leaned in too close, speaking in low voices, and something clenched in my chest. I shook it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. Hormonal. Pregnant and insecure. But the moments piled up. There were texts I wasn't supposed to see, inside jokes that didn't make sense, like, "Don't forget the lemon again," winky face, and "Still laughing about that thing you said." She didn't even catch it. I asked David about them once, casually, but he just smiled and said Celeste was funny, and it was nice to see her doing well. That word, funny, got stuck in my throat. As if Celeste hadn't always been the star of every room. As if she needed more applause. Then one night, he left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. I wish I could say I didn't mean to look, but that would be a lie. Something in me had already broken open, and I was digging through the pieces, desperate for a reason to trust again. But instead, I found it. Texts. Dozens. Hidden under a different contact name. Screenshots. Photos I couldn't bring myself to scroll through. And one message that made my whole body go numb. "The baby will have your eyes. She doesn't suspect a thing." I don't remember putting the phone down. I don't remember walking to the bedroom. All I remember is the sound of the shower and the way the world tilted on its axis as I sank to the floor, stomach twisting with nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. When he walked out in his towel, smiling like everything was normal, I looked at him and said, very quietly, "Celeste is pregnant, isn't she?" He froze. Just like that, no lies, no pretending. His face dropped, and I saw it all in an instant. Guilt. Shame. A flicker of relief, even, that the secret was out. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. He sat down and told me everything, like it was some kind of mercy. How he and Celeste had started talking more after the barbecue. How she understood him. How they hadn't planned for the baby, but now that it was real, they were considering a future together. My future, the one I had just started to build. But the worst part wasn't just the betrayal. It was what came next, when he told me why they did it. He said they knew I had money saved. That the career I'd worked so hard for had started to pay off. That if he divorced me after a few more months, with Celeste by his side and their baby in tow, he'd be guaranteed support, alimony, maybe even part of my business assets, depending on how the court ruled. It wasn't just an affair. It was a setup. A strategy. My husband and my sister had conspired to use me like a stepping stone, like I was nothing more than a means to an end. I couldn't scream. I couldn't cry. I just sat there, frozen, feeling the child inside me flutter for the first time. He reached for me, said something about how he never meant for it to get this far. And all I could think was how many times I had been the disposable one. The placeholder. The background. Not this time. I stood up, walked to the bathroom, and locked the door. I called a lawyer. I called a friend. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time, I didn't see the outsider. I saw a woman they'd underestimated. And I knew exactly what I had to do next. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up feeling like I'd aged 10 years overnight. The bed still smelled like David, and for a moment, before I opened my eyes, I forgot. I reached toward his side, instinctively empty. And then I remembered. Every word. Every lie. Every betrayal. I sat up, clutching the edge of the mattress, and breathed slowly through the nausea. Not the morning sickness kind. This was the kind that came from being gutted from the inside out. I didn't say anything to him when he returned later that day, just walked past him with a look that should have turned him to stone. The bags under his eyes told me he hadn't slept, but I didn't care. I didn't ask where he went. I didn't care about his explanations anymore. I'd moved past wanting answers. I wanted justice. The lawyer I'd called gave me an appointment that afternoon. She was sharp, no nonsense, and had the kind of presence that reminded me of the women I wanted to be when I was a teenager. I handed her the screenshots, the messages, the timeline. She flipped through them like she'd seen worse, and I suppose she probably had. When I mentioned that Celeste was pregnant and that David had admitted to planning to divorce me after securing financial support, her eyebrows lifted for the first time. "That's premeditated fraud," she said, tone clipped, like a surgeon identifying a tumor. "We'll need more evidence, but it's a strong start." I signed the paperwork that same day. Filed for divorce under irreconcilable differences. It felt too kind. But filing was only the beginning. I knew this wouldn't just be about lawyers and court dates. It was about family. Or whatever tangle of performance and obligation still passed for one. My parents would find out, and when they did, I already knew which way the wind would blow. I just didn't expect it to hit so fast. My mother called me 2 days later, voice sharp and cold like I was a stranger who had offended her at a grocery store. "What is this nonsense?" she snapped. "Divorcing David? Celeste is pregnant, Elena. And you're what, jealous?" I almost dropped the phone. "Jealous?" I echoed, stunned. "He cheated on me. With your daughter. My sister." There was a pause. Then, unbelievably, a scoff. "Celeste told us everything. You've always been difficult, Elena. Controlling. You've driven people away for years. You just can't stand that she's happy." I could have laughed if it didn't hurt so badly. It was almost cinematic, the way they flipped the narrative without blinking. I wasn't the betrayed wife. I was the bitter, unstable sister. The outsider once again. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a stunned breath. "You're siding with them," I said. "After everything." "You always twist things," my mother said calmly. "Maybe if you'd been a better wife, this wouldn't have happened." I hung up before I could say something I'd regret. After that, it was like a floodgate had opened. Calls from relatives. Messages from old family friends. Not to ask if I was okay. Not to check on the pregnancy. But to ask what I had done to drive David into Celeste's arms. It was surreal, like I'd stepped out of my life and into a twisted play where everyone had forgotten who I really was. Or maybe they never knew. And Celeste, she didn't even try to hide. She posted an ultrasound photo online 2 weeks later with the caption, "Can't wait to meet you, little love," and tagged David in it. Public. Shameless. As if I had never existed. As if I hadn't spent years building a life that they'd torn apart like it was disposable. I stopped crying after that. There was nothing left to mourn. I'd grieved the family I thought I had. I was done hoping for apologies or recognition or any version of closure they might offer. I didn't need it. What I needed now was survival. The court process was slow. David's lawyer was slick, and the moment we filed, he switched from apologetic to aggressive. They painted me as emotionally unstable, difficult to live with, controlling. He claimed he'd tried to make things work, that he only grew close to Celeste after our marriage deteriorated. Every lie added fuel to my fire. But the worst part? My parents submitted statements against me. They vouched for David. Said I had anger issues, that I was paranoid, that I'd always been jealous of Celeste and overly possessive in my relationships. Reading their signed affidavits was like being stabbed in the chest by ghosts I thought I'd buried. But even then, I didn't back down. I gathered my bank records. I documented the timeline. I stayed quiet in the courtroom, calm, composed, even when rage boiled under my skin. I watched the people I once loved pretend I never mattered. And I promised myself that I would rise from this. Even if I had nothing left when it was over. Even if I had to start again from scratch. Because this time, I would do it on my terms, and no one would ever use me as a stepping stone again. The courtroom was cold. Not physically, though the AC was on high, but emotionally, spiritually, cold. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I sat on the left side with my attorney, watching David across the aisle, his suit a little too perfect, his expression just the right mix of disappointment and restraint. He looked like the kind of man who had tried, who had given his all, and was now being unfairly punished. That was the story he was selling, and the judge, from her seat high above, didn't seem entirely uninterested. He took the stand and told lie after lie with a voice that barely wavered. He said I was difficult, that I controlled his every move, that I was cold and withholding, emotionally abusive, that our marriage was a prison and he had only found comfort with Celeste after months of being pushed away. The words twisted in my stomach like poison. And worse, I could see the courtroom eating it up, because David was practiced, poised, and convincing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap to my feet and show the text messages, the timeline, the manipulation. But my lawyer had warned me, let him hang himself slowly. Stay composed. Let the facts speak. But facts weren't enough. When my mother took the stand, I thought maybe, just maybe, she would hesitate. That she'd flinch under oath, show a crack in the performance. But she didn't. She swore I had always been intense. That I would lash out, that they had walked on eggshells around me. She said, in a trembling voice, that they had tried to love me, but I was distant, difficult, suspicious. It was a masterclass in character assassination, and I could do nothing but sit there and watch it happen. I didn't cry. I didn't let them see me crack. But inside, I felt something collapse. A final nail in a coffin I never agreed to build. The judge ruled after a week of testimony. David was awarded a generous alimony package. They cited emotional duress and instability as partial justification. He got the car, a portion of our joint savings. I was left with the apartment, which I could barely afford on my own, and a mountain of legal fees. And somehow, even after all of that, I felt more betrayed by the courtroom than by David. Because at least he never pretended to love me in the end. The legal system? It smiled while it bled me dry. Outside the courthouse, reporters stood back, uninterested, just another divorce. But to me, it felt like my life had been broadcast without anyone really watching. No one saw what mattered. That I had been loyal. That I had loved. That I had fought, not just for a marriage, but for a version of myself that believed I was finally safe. When I got home that night, I stood in the middle of the kitchen and stared at the spot where David used to make coffee. There were still 2 mugs in the cabinet, his favorite one with the chipped handle pushed to the back. I reached for it, turned it over in my hands, and then hurled it across the room. It shattered against the tile with a sound that felt like release. I sank to the floor, surrounded by shards, and let myself cry for the first time since the trial ended. Not just soft tears, but deep, racking sobs that came from someplace buried inside me. I cried for the child I had lost in the stress of it all, for the marriage that had never really been what I thought it was, for the family that had chosen convenience over truth. I cried until my face was hot and raw and I couldn't breathe. And then I got up. I swept the shards into a dustpan, dumped them in the trash, and turned on every light in the apartment. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. There were bills to pay, emails to answer, a life to reassemble. I wasn't going to let this be the end of me. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Every day after that felt like dragging myself through mud. My savings dwindled. I sold the engagement ring to cover expenses. I skipped dinners, stopped answering texts from the few friends who still checked in. I walked to work because I couldn't afford a new car. I watched as the version of my life I'd built so carefully crumbled, brick by brick, until I was standing alone in the dust. But through all that pain, something else began to grow, a quiet, stubborn rage. Not the destructive kind. The useful kind. The kind that made me wake up early, dress sharper, speak louder. The kind that reminded me I had survived much worse before. That I was nobody's victim. And when I looked in the mirror, past the tired eyes and hollow cheeks, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Me. Not the wife. Not the daughter. Not the outsider trying to earn her way in. Just me. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. New York didn't feel like home at first. It felt like a battlefield. Tall buildings, too many sirens, people who never made eye contact. But it also didn't feel like Ohio. It didn't feel like my parents' house, or the courtroom, or the sterile silence of the apartment David once called ours. That was enough for me. I didn't come to Manhattan looking for comfort. I came to survive. The job at the design firm was a miracle I hadn't seen coming. One of my old professors from Chicago had recommended me without my even asking. I packed what little I had left into 2 suitcases, shipped a box ahead, and took a one-way flight to LaGuardia. I didn't know a single person in the city. I didn't have a plan beyond that first paycheck. But I had grit, and by then, I had very little left to lose. The office was high-rise and polished, filled with people who didn't care about my past. They only cared about whether I could deliver under pressure, pitch ideas with clarity, and bring vision to reality. I could. I did. I buried myself in blueprints, renderings, revisions. I stayed late, skipped weekends, became a name whispered in meetings when they needed someone to fix what others couldn't. My reputation became my armor. The pain didn't vanish, it never really does, but it dulled into something I could live with. I stopped flinching every time I saw someone with a stroller. I stopped stalking Celeste's social media. I stopped rewriting conversations in my head, trying to find the version of the past where I stood my ground sooner. Some wounds don't heal clean. But you get used to walking with a scar. A year passed like that, blurred days, long nights, small victories. And then, one Thursday afternoon, my manager called me into a glass-walled conference room. I thought I was in trouble. I wasn't. They were promoting me. Senior design lead. A significant raise. My own team. My own office. I nodded, thanked her, kept my expression composed until the meeting ended. But as soon as I got back to my desk, I locked my screen, walked into the restroom, and leaned against the counter with shaking hands. I had done it. I had climbed out of the wreckage, brick by brick, and built something they couldn't take from me. This wasn't a handout. It wasn't a second chance given by someone who felt sorry for me. It was mine. That night, I didn't go out with coworkers or call anyone to celebrate. I didn't post about it. I just walked to a little restaurant I loved in Soho, the kind of place that didn't take reservations and always smelled like roasted garlic and warm bread. I sat at a corner table, ordered my favorite meal, and let myself savor it slowly. It was the first time in months I had eaten without distraction, without a laptop open or my phone buzzing beside me. Halfway through the meal, I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the table, dim candlelight, a plate of pasta, a glass of red wine. I hesitated. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, I opened Instagram. I hadn't posted anything since before the divorce. My account had been silent, dormant. I'd let it collect dust like an old diary I couldn't bear to open. But now, with the city humming outside the window and my heart beating steady again, I typed 3 words, dinner for one. Then I hit post. It wasn't meant to be a statement. It wasn't supposed to be a flag planted in triumph. It was just a moment I wanted to own. The likes started slowly. A few old friends. A couple of coworkers. Then more. DMs started popping in, you look amazing. Glad to see you happy. One from an old college roommate I hadn't spoken to in years. Proud of you, Elena. You deserve all of it. I smiled, Just a little. I didn't need validation, but it felt good to know someone was out there, seeing me not as a shadow of my past, but as the woman I had become. I finished the wine, paid the bill, and walked out into the cool night air. The city felt different now, not like a battlefield, but like a map. A place with paths I hadn't explored yet. A place where I could keep becoming. The worst part of losing everything is that you think you'll never feel whole again. But that night, standing under the glow of street lamps, I realized something important. I wasn't the same woman who had walked out of that courtroom shattered and broke. I was stronger, sharper, freer. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I wasn't waiting for my family to see me, or for a man to choose me, or for a sister to finally treat me like more than a shadow. I had chosen myself. And that made all the difference. 2 days. That's how long my peace lasted. It was a Monday when it started, gray skies, drizzle on the windows, the kind of morning where the city feels heavy. I was at my desk, coffee in hand, sketching out revisions for a client who couldn't make up their mind about anything when my phone lit up. I didn't recognize the number at first, and I almost didn't answer. But something in me hesitated. I swiped to accept, more out of curiosity than anything else. Elena, my mother's voice, sharp and familiar, cut through the line like a blade. I froze. My fingers curled around the mug, the ceramic suddenly too hot. Yes, I said, carefully, like stepping into a room full of broken glass. I saw your post, she said. That restaurant. That wine. You looked well. Very well. There was something unnatural about her tone. Not warm. Not angry. Calculated. I stayed silent. She filled the space quickly. Your father and I were talking. We were wondering if you might come by for a visit. I laughed. I couldn't help it. A short, humorless burst. You're joking, right? Elena, please, she said, tone shifting to something gentler. Just come. There's something we need to talk about. Face to face. Against every instinct I had, I agreed. I told myself it was closure. I told myself I'd walk in, let them speak their piece, and walk out with my spine a little straighter. But deep down, I think I already knew it wasn't going to be that simple. I showed up at their suburban home late that evening. The neighborhood looked the same, still postcard perfect in that eerie, step-forward way. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway. I didn't want them to think I was staying long. They opened the door like they'd been waiting by it, like they expected me to run. My mother ushered me in, all forced smiles and out-of-season candles, and my father gave a brief nod from the armchair. The air was thick with tension. Then I heard it, a baby crying. High-pitched. Persistent. I turned toward the hallway, and there she was. Celeste. Hair perfectly styled. Eyes puffy beneath makeup. Holding a wriggling infant in one arm like a shield. Her mouth twitched into a smile. Hey, stranger. I didn't reply. I looked at the baby, then at her, then back to my mother. What do you want? I asked, already tired. They got right to it. David had lost his job. The company downsized, or so he claimed, and his severance was barely enough to get them through the summer. Celeste's little online brand, something about sustainable events and motherhood, had flopped. They'd moved back in with my parents, just for a little while, but things were tight. The mortgage was overdue. Medical bills were piling up. They couldn't keep up. I blinked. And this has what to do with me? My mother flinched. Elena, we know you're doing well now. You've always been smart. Resourceful. We just thought, maybe. Celeste stepped forward, rocking the baby. We're family, she said, as if that word had ever meant the same thing to both of us. We thought you might be able to help. Just until we get back on our feet. I stared at them. At the audacity. At the gall of asking for a handout after everything they had taken from me. I was your scapegoat, I said quietly, your punching bag. You chose him over me. You watched me fall apart and called it my fault. And now, because your little golden world has cracked, you think I'm supposed to fix it? Elena, please, my mother said again, wringing her hands. That post, you looked happy. You looked like you were thriving. I stepped back, shaking my head. That's exactly what scared you, isn't it? That I found peace without you. that I didn't need to come crawling back. They looked stunned, like they hadn't expected me to remember the truth. Like they thought time had washed it all away. I turned toward the door without another word. Outside, the rain had started to fall harder, soaking my coat within seconds. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, voices, my mother pleading, Celeste's voice rising, my father's deep, distant muttering. "Elena, wait," Celeste called after me, stepping into the driveway barefoot, holding the baby beneath a blanket. "You can't just walk away. We need you." I turned slowly, rain dripping from my hair, clinging to my lashes. "You've needed me before," I said, voice clear over the downpour. "And every time, it came with a knife in my back." "We're your family," my mother gasped. "You can't just abandon us." I let out a long breath, chest tight with something between grief and fury. Then I said it, the words I had been holding onto for years. "Try begging strangers," I said. "They'll get more sympathy than for me." And then I got in my car, closed the door, and drove away, windshield wipers barely keeping up, heart pounding like thunder. I didn't look back. I don't think I felt the rain until I reached the end of the driveway. That's the funny thing about rage, it burns so hot you don't feel the cold until much later. It was only when I turned back to the house, watched them standing there in their carefully constructed chaos, that I realized I was soaked. Rain had matted my hair to my neck, traced streams down my cheeks like tears I refused to shed. They were still standing on the porch like actors waiting for their cue, expecting me to break, to return, to offer some final act of submission. My mother had her arms folded tightly across her chest, jaw clenched in the way I remembered from childhood arguments. My father stood behind her, silent as always, his loyalty mute and unmovable. And Celeste, my sister, clutched that baby like a bargaining chip, face painted in mock hurt, trying to look like the victim she had practiced being her whole life. I stared at them, unmoving, breath heavy in my chest. There it was again, that expectation. That I would put aside the years of betrayal. That I would remember some imagined bond we'd never had. That I would forget the courtroom, the lies, the months of isolation while they stood beside the man who tore my life apart. It wasn't just audacity. It was entitlement. "You came here thinking what?" I asked, my voice low but cutting through the storm. "That you'd guilt me into bailing you out?" "Elena, it's not about guilt," Celeste began, stepping forward, adjusting the blanket over the baby's head like the rain wasn't pouring, like the optics still mattered more than truth. "No," I interrupted, voice louder now. "It's always about guilt with you. You and Mom, masters at rewriting history. At spinning stories where you're the victims and I'm the bitter, unstable one." My mother's mouth opened, but I didn't give her the chance. "You didn't call me for a year. You didn't reach out after the divorce. You stood by David, defended his lies, testified against me. You told a courtroom I was mentally unwell so he could bleed me dry, and now you want help." The wind howled through the trees. Rain slapped the pavement in angry bursts. "You're being dramatic," my mother snapped, voice rising to meet the storm. "We did what we thought was right for the family." I laughed, sharp, hollow. "The family? You mean your version of it? The one where Celeste shines and I'm expected to orbit quietly around her." She flinched then, just slightly, like something had hit home. But I didn't stop. "You chose her, over and over. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every time I cried for your attention, and you handed it to her like I hadn't even spoken. And now, when she burns down her life, you come running to the daughter you never cared to know. I don't owe you a damn thing." Celeste stepped forward again, her eyes wide. "I didn't mean for everything to happen like this." "You meant it exactly like this," I snapped. "You wanted what I had. My husband, my stability, my life. You didn't just fall into his arms, you plotted it. And now that it's all crumbling, you think showing me your baby will make me forget?" I looked at the child then, small, innocent, unaware of the storm it had been born into. For a moment, my chest ached. But it wasn't love. It was pity. Not for Celeste, not for David, not even for myself anymore. But for the baby trapped in a family that would rewrite its story the moment it spoke. "No," I said softly, but with finality. "You don't get to spin this anymore. Not with me. I turned and walked toward the car, shoes sloshing in puddles, water dripping down my back. Behind me, I heard footsteps, shouting, my mother's voice breaking with anger, Celeste crying out, begging me to stop. But I didn't look back. I opened the door, slid into the seat, slammed it shut. The engine groaned to life, windshield wipers swiping rhythmically, and still, they stood there in the driveway like the end hadn't happened yet. Like I might still turn around. I rolled down the window just enough for my voice to carry. Try begging strangers, I said. They'll get more sympathy than for me. Then I rolled it back up and hit the gas. The rain blurred their faces in the rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely. Gone. Just like the version of me that used to crave their love. That version was buried now, drowned in the storm they created. I drove until the suburban sprawl gave way to highways, until the buildings grew taller again, and the streets buzzed with the noise of people who didn't know my name. My coat clung to me like a second skin, soaked through, but I didn't care. I felt electric, alive in a way I hadn't in years. They had come to me with empty hands and entitled demands, assuming I was still the Elena who could be guilted into giving. But that woman was gone. And the woman who remained? She knew her worth. I knew they wouldn't go quietly. That was the thing about people like David and Celeste. They didn't just take. They circled back when the well ran dry, convinced they still had some claim. So I wasn't surprised when the certified letter arrived at my apartment a week later. It sat in my mailbox like a coiled snake. I carried it upstairs with shaking hands and stared at it on the kitchen table for almost an hour before I finally slit it open with the tip of a steak knife. Inside, notice of intention to petition the court for an increase in alimony. It was laughable, really. The audacity of it. The same man who cheated, manipulated, and walked away with half my savings now claimed he needed more. Celeste had signed on as co-petitioner, claiming hardship, an unemployed mother with an infant, relying on a struggling household. They painted me as the one withholding support. A woman living in luxury while her ex-husband and sister suffered. I stared at the paper in disbelief. They were turning their failures into a legal strategy. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and called my lawyer. When I read the petition aloud, she paused. They're desperate, she said. Which means now is exactly the right time to hit back. Something ignited in me then, not just anger, but clarity. I had spent so much of my life reacting, defending, absorbing blows in silence and telling myself I could take it. But this? This was the moment to go on the offensive. We started building immediately. My lawyer, Maya Whitman, a no-nonsense powerhouse out of Manhattan, was relentless. She told me, bluntly, that if I wanted to win, I'd have to dig deep. Show the pattern. Prove the emotional manipulation and betrayal that stretched far beyond the affair. So I did. I reached out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old coworkers who remembered the way David used to flirt with Celeste during work events. Friends from college who had witnessed the cracks in my family's foundation firsthand. Cousins who had long stopped attending family gatherings because of how I was treated. Each call brought a rush of adrenaline and something else. Validation. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the cruelty. It had always been there, carefully cloaked in polite smiles and family photos. One afternoon, I met with an old friend from undergrad, Carla, who had seen me through some of the hardest nights of my early 20s. We sat at a cafe in the West Village, and when I told her everything, she didn't flinch. She nodded, reached across the table, and said, I always knew they were parasites. Let's make sure the court knows too. She signed a sworn affidavit the next day. Every piece of testimony added to our case like armor. We collected screenshots, timelines, emails, even security footage from a restaurant where David and Celeste had been seen dining alone long before the affair came to light. The date on the receipt? 2 weeks before I told David I was pregnant. Still, Maya warned me not to get too comfortable. They'll fight back. And they'll lie. But if you stay calm, composed, and armed with truth, they won't stand a chance. The court date arrived faster than I expected. This time, I didn't show up in muted tones or with nervous energy. I wore a tailored navy suit, heels that clicked with purpose, and a quiet fire in my chest. David barely met my eyes when I walked in. Celeste, sitting beside him in a pale pink blouse and a look she must have practiced in the mirror, gave me a brittle smile. I didn't return it. Maya handled the opening statements like a scalpel, precise, sharp, devastating. She laid out the sequence of events, the financial manipulations, the collusion between David and Celeste. Then she introduced the evidence. Witness after witness. Document after document. It wasn't just a case against more alimony, it was a complete deconstruction of their credibility. At one point, David tried to interrupt a witness, an old HR manager who confirmed he and Celeste had taken extended lunches long before I discovered the affair. The judge shut him down with a sharp warning. By the end of the day, their case looked like a house built on matchsticks. When the judge finally ruled, her voice was firm, petition denied. Alimony terminated, effective immediately. Any further financial demands deemed baseless and retaliatory. David slumped in his seat like someone had pulled the bones from his body. Celeste turned to him, mouth open, as if she couldn't believe the script had flipped. But the best part came later, outside the courthouse. They followed me to the sidewalk, desperate. David called after me, voice rising. "You can't just walk away from this, Elena." I turned, looked him square in the eye, and didn't say a word. I didn't owe him anger. I didn't owe him closure. When he stepped toward me, hand outstretched, I pulled out my phone and calmly, clearly, called the police. That stopped him. They backed away, retreating like smoke dispersing in the wind. And for the first time in my life, I felt untouchable. The sound of the door clicking shut behind me was quieter than I expected, but final. I stood in the middle of my apartment, heels still on, bag slung over my shoulder, my coat damp with the lingering mist from the courthouse steps. My heart hadn't stopped pounding, not from fear, but from something sharper. Satisfaction. Relief. Power. I stood still for a long moment, staring at the light filtering through the windows and letting it sink in. It was over. David and Celeste were done. The courtroom battle, the years of humiliation, the endless fight for dignity, it was finished. The judge had stripped away the lies, the manipulation, and for once, someone with authority had looked at the truth and believed me. Alimony terminated. Their petition dismissed. Their facade shattered. I had spent so long fighting to be heard that silence now felt strange. But it wasn't the silence of being ignored, overlooked, erased. It was peace. And I hadn't realized how deeply I craved it until I was standing in it. I set my bag down and walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, then leaned against the counter, letting the cool edge press into my back. The city moved outside my window, cars, lives, noise, and for once, none of it touched me. I had a small empire here. Not in the way people imagine wealth or luxury, but in the way that matters more. Everything inside these walls was mine. My choices. My voice. My boundaries. It wasn't long before the knock came. Firm. Repeated. I didn't move right away. I knew who it was. Some part of me had been waiting for it. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and sure enough, there they were. All three of them. My mother, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line so thin it might disappear. My father, silent and tired beside her. And David, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched like he didn't know how to shrink himself any further. I opened the door, but just barely. "Elena," my mother said quickly, as if the words might evaporate if she didn't say them fast enough. "We need to talk." I didn't step back. "No, you need to listen." She blinked, thrown off. "You have spent your life making me small," I said, voice calm, even. "You dismissed my pain. You sided with liars. You watched me break, and you didn't blink." "Elena, that's not fair," she started. I held up my hand. "I'm not interested in defending myself anymore. You can take your version of the truth and tell it to anyone who'll still listen. But you won't tell it here." David shifted beside her. "We just came to say we didn't expect things to go like this." A laugh bubbled up in my chest. Not bitter. Not angry. Just tired. "Didn't expect consequences?" That's what this is. Consequences. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me anymore, and I realized he didn't. He had only ever known the version of me that doubted herself. The one who second-guessed, made herself small, apologized just for existing. He didn't know this version. The one who no longer asked for permission to be whole. Celeste wasn't with them. Coward. We wanted to apologize, my mother said, and for the first time, her voice cracked. Truly. We see now that we should have done better. I shook my head. It's too late. She looked like she might cry, and for a split second, I felt the echo of a younger me reaching out, hoping for warmth. But I shut the door on that echo. It had led me down too many dead ends. Elena, my father said quietly, finally speaking. Can't we move forward? I studied his face, the man who had watched it all happen, and said nothing. A silent witness to my erasure. He didn't look cruel. He never did. Just complicit. I stepped back. Not to let them in. Just far enough to let them see the choice in my eyes. No, I said. I'm moving forward. You're staying right where you've always been together without me. David stepped toward the doorframe, hands raised slightly, placating. If you'd just let us. I didn't let him finish. I closed the door. Locked it. Called the police. The dispatcher was calm. Are they being aggressive? No, I said. But I told them to leave. They're on private property. I just want them gone. By the time the officers arrived, they were already walking away. My mother turned once, as if expecting me to stop her. I didn't. I stood by the window, watching them disappear down the street, smaller with each step. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel hollow watching them go. I didn't feel desperate or sad or broken. I felt free. Not because they left, but because I didn't follow. I turned away from the glass, back into the warmth of my space, and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket. I breathed in deeply. Slowly. No more trying. No more begging to be loved. No more shrinking. Just me. And it was enough.